Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy in my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now, to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Ali Dianaty. He's the Vice President of Product Innovation at Medtronic, part of the diabetes business portion of their business. So we're going to talk about his work. Ali, thank you for coming.
My pleasure, Richard. Thanks.
Yeah, I know Medtronic has many decades history of working in medical products, but if you would just tell me about your position and Medtronic itself, and then the specific work that you're involved in.
Sure. So as part of what I do for my Medtronic, and the title is of course product innovation, but really what that means is all things related to the development of products. So that's inclusive of research and development, clinical, regulatory, and then as it relates to program management as well as part of that. So it's really intended to be set up so that the end-to-end pieces needed to get a product out the door are located in one shop. And that's essentially what I do.
Okay. So in the diabetes unit of Medtronic, what kind of projects are you involved in? What are they working on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we work on treating for essentially anybody that is taking insulin at this time. So we make insulin pumps, smart pens as well, the CGMs that are used or the continuous glucose monitors that are used to measure how much the sugar levels within people with diabetes. And then ultimately the algorithms and the insights that are used to also automatically dose and to provide help to those that need it in terms of trying to calculate how much insulin that they need. And then last but not least, we have a caroling system, as we call it, which is for healthcare practitioners and patients as well to see how they are doing on the device and also to give them a snapshot into their diabetes management as well.
Yeah, myself and my wife have worn, like the Dexcom, and she's doing the Libre Lifestyle CGMs. So we tried them, and it was a huge help. She would stick her finger a lot, and I'm afraid of sticking my finger because it hurts. But with the CGM, it was painless, and it's really cool. You could see the blood sugar levels all day and night, and we go to different restaurants and see what the results were. And sometimes if our sugar was high, we'd go for a walk and that would bring it down. And, we could tell if we slept well or not, depending on the sugar levels. So they're like super helpful devices.
That's exactly right. And ironically, we're using a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence to take what you just described and make that more automated for people so that, they can understand how meals affect them or how exercise helps them or how a good, 7 or 8 hours of sleep can make a difference. So that's actually, one of the advances that we're working through right now.
You mentioned a smart pen. What is that?
That's a great question. So, insulin in terms of dosing it typically is done with an injection. And those injections are manually done, meaning that a person cranks up how much insulin they need, through the pen itself. And then as a result of that, then injects it. So let's say they take a meal with a certain amount of carbohydrates, they match that to their needs and then crank up the amount of insulin that they need and then inject themselves. And what a smart pen does, that of course is all manual, and that of course is not something that is database. So think of it as, and you kind of mentioned, when you eat, you see the variation that comes with the CGM. Quite frankly, the smart pen does the other side of that, is that for those meals, and if you need insulin and you inject yourself, you kind of want to see if you did a good job with that injection, meaning that did you give yourself enough or too much? And by tracking that over time, you get the power of the data, just like you did with CGM, but more importantly, with insulin, so that you can do a better job of keeping yourself in range. And so think of it as a connected version of a very mechanical and memory-based system. And as a result of that, conveying the information back to the user or the clinician to be able to make future references and inferences off of it. And then more importantly, to optimize and titrate their diabetes better so that they get better outcomes.
And when people inject insulin, I've heard there's fast acting, there's more longer term acting. Do people tend to inject just one type, or do they do a cocktail that's tailored to the type of foods they're eating and how much they ate and how much carbs they had?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, just taking a step back for a second, what your body needs is enough insulin, to basically keep the lights on, so to speak. So, just to take care of your normal everyday activity. That's called basal insulin or background insulin sometimes. And so that is one type, at least in the injection space, of insulin that people use. And then, for meals where you get a sudden rush of sugar into your bloodstream, that requires bolus insulin. And so that's a different type of insulin for that. Now, that's, of course, if you're taking injections. When you are on a insulin pump, you actually just take the bolus insulin, but it monitors or meters how much insulin you get for that background insulin. So that basal insulin is still using the same type, but it slows the flow down to keep the lights on, so to speak. And then when you eat, you tell the system that you're eating and how much you ate. And then as a result of that, it provides a bolus as well. So it depends on if you're on multiple daily injections. There's two types typically. And if you're on a pump, it's usually just one.
And it has I don't know if this device exists, but has an insulin pump been partnered with a CGM? So the CGM is giving feedback to the pump. Okay, we're overshooting, we're undershooting. Give more,
Absolutely.
Hold off, slow it down.
Yeah, absolutely. So believe it or not, Medtronic came up with that technological advancement many years ago, so that at least people could see, and the trajectory of this was first and foremost giving people those insights of the CGM, just like you had mentioned earlier in our conversation. From there, we used the CGM to decide when to stop the flow of insulin. And the reason for that is often what could happen is that maybe you overestimated how much you ate, or what happens quite a bit is that, typically people provide themselves a bolus ahead of eating and then decide that they don't want to finish the full meal, or they get distracted and stop eating for some reason. But that insulin is still in your body. And so what the first advent of the connection between continuous glucose monitoring and the pump was to essentially shut off that insulin for safety reasons, so that people did not go to a very low sugar level or hypoglycemia, as it's technically called. And the reason for that is that, there are some adverse events as a result of having or getting into that range of hypoglycemia. And, we want to avoid that at all costs. So that was the first advent. And then about 5 years ago, we came up with, again, a first in the industry, the notion of what we call hybrid closed loop. And what that does is, if you remember, I mentioned, this basal insulin or this background insulin and the need for that to keep the lights on, on a day for day basis. And I think you also mentioned this, so I'll use it as an analogy. When you're walking relative to laying down or watching TV, the background insulin you need is very different. It changes with your activity. And of course, with severe activity, even like exercise, it changes even more. In any event, as you go through your day, it meters up and it meters down depending upon your demand, right? And so what a hybrid closed loop system does is takes the CGM data, does a prediction of where and how things are going in terms of, are you going higher in terms of your glucose levels or lower, and then meters how much insulin is going into your body. And then from there, it actively is trying to keep you in range.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
And maybe just to give you another sense of an easy way to describe this, and to take a little bit of a step back here to help frame it a little better. It's like your body is like a tank. Let's just say it's like a gas tank, and that gas tank you're always trying to keep at a certain level. And as you use energy, that gas tank, and if you will, is going to drop. So think of that as you exercise, your glucose levels are going to start to drop. And similarly, if you eat, you're adding to that tank. And so as a result of adding to that level is going up. And so our job is to make sure that we keep that line leveled at a healthy rate. Typically, that is considered something between, in healthy people, 90 and 100 mgdl, which is the technical way of measuring that. And that's what your CGM provides you in terms of a number. And so what this hybrid closed loop system is trying to do is get you leveled in a safe zone, irrespective of, what's going on in your day-to-day life, and make sure also, to protect you from going low.
How come, these pumps don't include also a little reservoir of like super concentrated glucose so that, if they overshoot, they can do more than just stop inputting and also give a little bit of glucose to bring someone back from a hypoglycemic event if something happens?
Yeah, that's another great question. So think of it as there's a number of reasons. So there are academic studies that are happening based on that front and trying to do that. The interesting thing is that when you have, let's say, 2 reservoirs like that, one for what's called glucagon, which is the essential opposite of what insulin is, what that does is first and foremost creates a lot of complexity, for the person with diabetes, because you now have to fill not only your insulin and make sure that that's okay, but you got to fill the glucagon and make sure that that's okay. Then as it relates to, attachment to your body, you have to have 2 methods of getting that into your body. And that's, stuff that's associated with it. And, quite frankly, the way that these newer algorithms are working, the demand or need to do something like that is actually quite limited. What we're seeing in clinical studies and the like is the likelihood of going low is a pretty infrequent event these days because of these things that I had mentioned before, stopping insulin flow and actually doing a better job of making sure that people are getting the right titration of insulin in their body. And so it turns out to be more burden and more work to have something like that included than it does if you can just do a good job with the insulin itself. Now, the other thing to note based off of that, though, is that, if you have the glucagon there, you tend to use more insulin because you're essentially not forcing yourself to be efficient with the insulin. And it turns out both glucagon and insulin are rather expensive. And so to some degree, it would, not to say that it would make our algorithm designers lazy, but it's a good thing to stay efficient as possible so that, we're not costing the healthcare system a ton of money and what I would call wasted insulin because we're using that glucagon to overcome it.
Well, I mean, certain people, I guess type 1s could be in emergency situations, if they're sleeping throughout the night. And what if they just go very low for some reason because of what they had during the day? What if they're in an emergency situation? They just don't wake up. They may not want to set alarms.
Absolutely.
Like that.
Yeah.
Or, a type 1 again is, maybe you have a system that's maybe higher priced for people that really are in danger of super low events. And it only activates in emergency situations. Maybe it can tell if the person's passed out or I don't know.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
It's a great comment. And we've surveyed a lot of folks on this. And, though that seems attractive, on paper, when we have offered that up to them as something, for their day-to-day life, they've avoided it. And the truth is that most people with diabetes want to forget that they have it. And as a result of what the complexities are with a system like that, it adds more, I would say, burden in that regard than it does relief in terms of worrying about an event like that occurring. And most of that has to do with the fact that our latest algorithms and the advent of CGM have gotten good enough where that concern overnight has been pretty limited. Though I'm not discrediting the notion of having glucagon available in case of an emergency, but having it 100% available, to use whenever you're on a pump is where, that trade-off occurs.
Yeah, it makes sense. So when's Medtronic going to make a continuous insulin monitor? Is that a very difficult task or what?
Yeah, it's something that we have kicked around quite a bit. We have ideas on how to go about doing that, but it turns out that the value of something like that relative to having, let's just say, more accurate CGM, diminishes rather quickly. And the other thing that would help and maybe again to take a little bit of a step back, the thing that we're fighting more often than not in this disease management is a series of what I would call time constants. And what I mean by that is, for the insulin, in order to be absorbed into the body, it takes time, right? It's not like it's an immediate relief of that into the body. And so, there's pharmacokinetic that drive that. And of course, all the insulin companies are working towards making faster and faster and faster acting insulins. So that's one thing that we're fighting. The other is there's a time constant also for the CGM reading relative to, like a finger stick. There's a time delay between, as you had a chance to experience, that continuous glucose monitors goes into the subcutaneous tissue. It's not directly in your bloodstream. And your bloodstream, of course, is what we care about most in order to see what your glucose levels are. And that's why finger sticks are still noted as being the most accurate way for anybody around to be able to get that kind of information. The difference is, of course, the trending with CGM. But nonetheless, let's just say it takes 10 to 15 minutes at sometimes, maybe even up to an hour for the insulin to act. And then the CGM in relation to your bloodstream is off by something, in the order of 5 to 10 minutes. Those time constants add up. And so that's what we're constantly fighting. And we're using, predictive algorithms and the means of watching how, an individual metabolizes food and then accommodating that by preempting some of these things in our newer algorithms. That's the direction that's all going.
Yeah, so what are the bottlenecks you see in terms of diabetes care for patients? Like where do they, where is it not smooth for them? And I'm sure you guys are looking at that to make it a seamless experience.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one is probably access, honestly. It's not, if you have insurance and, are able to, afford it, it's available to you. And the capabilities of that are definitely available to you. But there's plenty of people, that have that and are not able to do that. And, on our side of the house, working hard towards making sure that, we bridge those gaps of those inequities. So that's one big one. I think the other thing that we're seeing, and more so than not, especially in this time frame, is, the toughest thing to do. And I don't know if you have any experience with this, but, we ask people with diabetes to essentially count how many carbs they have in every meal. Remember, to give themselves an injection every time they eat. And, that's not straightforward. I mean, it's really not easy. I don't know what you had maybe for lunch or for dinner recently, but do you know how many carbs were that accurately? Probably not. And
you just got to eyeball it. I mean, over time, you may get to know, but certainly not in the first few weeks of paying attention to it.
Sure. And when you're eyeballing it, to your point, what do you think the accuracy of that is relative to the insulin that you're dosing yourself with? Right. And so,
yeah, it could be easily like 30% different, easily.
That's exactly right. And so Our data suggests actually that was a pretty good guess. It's actually 30 to 40% error on average for people, aside from, again, going back to the timing that matters and the like, because those things matter too. And so what we've been doing is working on, two things I would say that are super important in order to accommodate that. One is to know when people are eating, because if we know when, we can get more aggressive with the insulin dosing and then keep up, so to speak. So that using that tank analogy, we can keep the tank level. The other is, something that you brought up also, which is how much, like what is the value of that meal that you had in terms of carb load, and how do you, quantify that? And so we have two specific technologies that we think are going to make a big difference as a result of that. One of them we call Clue, which is essentially taking, a smartwatch, if you would, a wearable, and using gesture recognition to know when people are essentially putting food in their mouth. And, that will help us, of course, identify when people are eating. And to some degree, depending upon how many times they do that gesture, you can get a sense for how much. Of course, that's not perfectly accurate because it depends on the food content and what you're eating. So, if you're having a candy bar relative to some salad, the carb loads are completely different for those two things. And so the other thing that we're looking at is, and have a lot of data on, is something that we also acquired, which is essentially a food database through a company we call Neutrino. They have the largest food database in the world. And part of the reason why we want that is because the actual nutrition information of that food, helps us decide how much insulin to dose and when to dose it also. So, if you have a really high fat meal, you're going to want to spread out that insulin dose a lot longer. If you have a very, very high sugar meal, of course, you would want to get it into the body sooner. And Neutrino helps us decide on those kinds of things. Aside from the other thing, and I don't know, just trying to make it practical for you to think about is, the last time you went to your favorite restaurant, did you happen to order the same thing?
I don't remember. What I do remember though is if I ordered the same meal, at least on paper, from different restaurants, we got radically different blood sugar responses. So you can't see the difference, but if you get, I don't know, chicken with like chicken parmesan with spaghetti, let's say, it can be radically different depending on how the restaurant prepares it. That's what I noticed.
Very good. That's exactly right. And so that is definitely absolutely true. And this goes back to the notion of the nutrients that are in it, right? So not all chicken parms, to your point, are the same. And so what the other thing that Neutrino has is essentially it's taking the phone and using it as a bed of sensors. And so as a result of, let's say, being at a different location, but you still ordering chicken parm, it can look into its database and see how others metabolize that chicken parm relative to a typical chicken parm, and then dose accordingly because it knows that there's are statistical differences between that meal and from other places. And then similarly for yourself, if you did happen to order that same meal twice, it would go back and reference the last time you ate it. And then based on that, give you insights into how it should be dosed for the second time here and actually take control of that if you allow it to. So think of it as if you came back and had that chicken parm again, it would know how to optimize the insulin dosing based off of that meal. So that's
great.
Part of what.
Yeah, I can see if you had a database of, I don't know, a couple million different foods. I mean, there's no way that anyone can get anywhere close to the power of a database like that. And it could also say to you, remember the number 255? Well, that was your blood sugar last time you ate this, so don't do it.
Well, we don't like saying no, but we do instead say things like, hey, this time around, this would be a better way to handle it. And so we try to not to do things because, they need to live their life, but understand.
Yeah, maybe the New York version would be mean to you, and then you could have a nicer version, different personalities.
Yeah, we that's definitely an option.
Well, very cool. So just a question or two more. What's the future? What do the next 5 years look like for Medtronic for diabetes care? What's coming?
Yeah, so we actually just recently got an approval on our advanced hybrid closed loop algorithm. And, I did mention hybrid closed loop, but the advanced version also does something else that I think is very important. And, we just finished talking about meals here and carb counting. But really what happens a lot of the time is people under club, how many carbs they're eating, for example, or even forget for that matter. and need to correct or add insulin later to make up for that. And this new algorithm actually automatically does that for people. And in other words, if we see that someone, underdosed, so to speak, we will add insulin and make up for that, relieving them of a lot of the headache of coming back to thinking about their diabetes again. And so we automatically take care of that. And so we got the approval for that in Europe some time ago. And I'll tell you, people really, really, really love it. It's really helping them not only stay in range, as I mentioned, or maintaining their glucose levels, but it's taken away a lot of the effort in carb counting for them as well, mainly because, they don't have to be perfect at it anymore. And so as long as they're in the ballpark, the system will make up for it.
Oh, I was just going to interject. I remember I tried keeping a food diary for a few weeks, and some days, I didn't eat a lot of things. It was easy. And some days I seemed to have like 10 different snacks. And on those days, it's just such a pain to put all that into the food diary and to count the carbs and everything. It's just like, forget it. So I understand why making it easier for people is the key factor.
Yeah, and ironically, you're no different than many of the people that we have surveyed on this. 2 weeks is kind of the limit of people's tolerance for being able to do something like that in terms of a diary. And, to your point also, people like to snack, and for all the right reasons, they deserve to. And so this system is very forgiving in that way because it allows for it, to manage that part very readily, and it does it in a 5-minute to 5-minute interval. So it's not waiting to help make those decisions and keep people in range. It just takes care of it for you. So that's the newest one. Aside from that, I kind of mentioned where we're going with this neutrino database and integrating that into the system alongside a clue, which was the gesture tracking. But all of that is built around many, many insights that we have because, quite frankly, we have millions and millions and millions of patient days worth of data from our CareLink system. And we've been able to glean a lot of interesting notions from that we now are able, in a way that's not intrusive to people, but in an effort to help them, give them back information that would make them more successful with their disease management. So that's another thing that will be coming very shortly. And then I think the other advent that's also new for us is, this smart pen, as I mentioned, but integrating that with CGM is now available. And then ultimately getting after more titration or the ability to not only handle, what they have for meals in a simple way, but also to balance out what their basal loads need to be on that other injection. So, folks, because they take 2 different prescriptions, as I mentioned earlier, optimizing those so it takes the burden not only off of them, but off of their clinician as well. And so those are all very near term. And of course, wearing the pump itself has plenty of improvements we can make. And one of those is, the way that the insulin gets into the body is through what we call an infusion set. So similar to CGM, where it goes into the subcutaneous area of the body, this infusion set does the same, and a short little cannula goes inside of the body to diffuse the insulin into the body that way. And we have now come up with, and it's available also in Europe, the means of doubling the lifespan of those cannulas, because quite frankly, it's very difficult to keep them on the body beyond 3 days, mainly because the insulin crystallizes and gums it up. But our new design takes care of that and extends it to 7 days. So it takes more of the burden out of managing this disease. So that's just a snapshot. We got plenty more.
No, that's great. Well, Ali, thank you very much. It sounds like, obviously Medtronic understands the market really deeply, and they're coming out with all kinds of great products and protocols to make people, I guess, live seamlessly. So someone with diabetes, like you said, the less they have to think about it and worry about it, and they can live a normal life. That's what they really want. And it sounds like you guys are delivering it. So that's excellent.
That's exactly right. I mean, our goal every day is to make sure that we can help people forget about the fact that they have diabetes and do that in a very non-intrusive way, because quite frankly, that's what they deserve.
Okay, well, very good. So how can listeners find out more about Medtronic and what they're doing?
Yeah, so obviously we have a website and Facebook and Instagram presence. So those are all good places. Our website's medtronicdiabetes.com. We also have quite a bit of online resources as well. So if you just search for Medtronic Diabetes, that would come on up. But there's plenty of information there for folks to check out.
Very good, Ali. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Richard.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.